Imagine this. It's 2009, you're in the midst of a global financial crisis, the iPhone 3GS just released, and the final episode of King of the Hill just aired on TV. But none of this matters to you right now because you're a man in Switzerland, and you're trying to create a new type of running shoe. One that will give the perfect sensation to runners, so much so that they never go back to their old shoes. The challenge is, you have no actual experience creating shoes, and no partnerships with the big shoe companies. So how do you go about starting a shoe company, especially since there's been so many dominant shoe companies that have been around for decades, with the leaders mostly being created in the 1900s? How do you even get started at something like this or get it off the ground?
Do you pinch yourself sometimes, realizing like you made this all happen through hard work and look at where you are now?
Yeah, it's pretty much, I mean, every, now and then you think, wow, this is really happening. But then it's also what I've always dreamt of.
This man's name is Olivier Bernhard, former professional runner, 6-time Ironman champion, and 3-time world duathlon champion. So he does actually have a lot of expertise in the sport of running, and he also has chronic Achilles tendon pain, which contributed to his obsession with finding a running shoe that has a cushioned sole for landing, but also a firm base to push forward while running. One day, Olivier got a call from an old friend and engineer named George, who told him that he wanted to show him a new running shoe that he had an idea for. George wanted Olivier to mail him a shoe so that he could make a couple of modifications to it and send it back to him for testing. So that's exactly what he did. Olivier sent him a shoe, and then he received it back sometime later from George. The main difference was that a bunch of cut-up garden hose pieces were glued to the bottom of the shoe. This was not some high-tech prototype developed in a factory or a sample run of shoes at this stage. This was literally a different shoe that had been modified by gluing pieces of a garden hose to the sole of the shoe. The idea was that it would act as cushioning for the runner, and when compressed will still be firm so that the runner is stable when pushing off of the ground. And this is not an exaggeration either. This is a recreation of what the original prototype was estimated to look like. The thing was though, this actually worked. Despite its interesting look and the garden hose construction, he noticed that his Achilles pain was significantly reduced. And it had the feeling of running on clouds. So he just went with it. He doubled down on this prototype and began pitching it to others. Originally, Olivier pitched his new shoe technology to all of the big shoe brands with the more developed early prototype, but he was rejected by all of them. So it was then that he reached out to his 2 friends, David Alleman and Casper Capetti. The 3 of them were already friends from the past, but David and Casper were initially skeptical of Olivier's garden hose prototypes. When Olivier first approached Casper about helping with marketing, Casper's immediate response was no. He thought he was crazy for going up against the big brands like Nike and Adidas, and same story with David. Neither of them were convinced at first, but Olivier managed to get both of them to at least try out the shoe before giving him a firm no. To test the technology without being seen wearing these garden hose shoes, they would only go for runs at night or on isolated trails, because they were embarrassed of being seen wearing these prototypes. But it was during one of these secret runs that they realized the garden hose technology worked. It made running fun. So they officially teamed up and got to work on creating a prototype for the shoe that was professional enough to present to a wider market, while still having their unique look and the open hole cloud technology. But their agreement to team up wasn't just a handshake agreement between friends. Each of them personally contributed to the startup of the company and agreed that if any of them took another job, they would lose their shares entirely. They weren't sitting on venture capital funding with someone else's money on the line. They were 3 people who had written personal checks and then legally locked themselves into the company so that none of them could quietly leave and get another job or do something else. They agreed that they had to be all in or they would lose everything that they'd put in. They reached an agreement with George, who, if you remember, is the engineer from the start of the story, to use the patents for the shoe technology. And they were ready to go headfirst into creating this new shoe. The result was a brand new style of shoe that looked different to anything else on the market. And they turned the once embarrassing garden hose feature of the shoe into a key design element of the shoe that helped them stand out from all of the other shoes on the market. Once they had the shoe prototype based on that, they needed to figure out how to actually take this unique shoe and get it in front of people who might be interested in buying it. And not just anyone. It needed to be among people that would be early adopters of this largely unknown brand to take them from 0 sales ever at all to their first few orders and essentially get off the ground. Well before On became the fitness lifestyle brand that it is today, where essentially anyone wears it, it was originally a niche shoe company that designed high-end, high-tech running shoes specifically for enthusiast runners. And at the time, when you put these new On shoes alongside the major competitors like Nike, Adidas, Puma, and Asics, that had more than a half a century head start at building social proof to prove they were the best option, from celebrity sponsorships to massive advertising campaigns, and the fact that if you had seen runners on the street, chances are they are wearing one of these major brands. So why take the risk and spend several $100s on a completely unknown shoe? It takes a specific crowd of niche enthusiast runners that also happen to be forward-thinking early adopters that are willing to try a new shoe just to have the opportunity of being at the forefront of running technology and to become the person who was wearing these shoes before everyone else. And for On and their unique looking shoe, originally designed with garden hoses, they found that group of people when they entered their prototype into the ISPO Brand New Award, which is essentially like the Olympics of startups in the sport business, because it focuses specifically on startups and newcomers, and it gives awards to companies in each category. It's one of the most prestigious prizes for innovation in the sporting goods industry, and gave the On prototype shoe, which was a further developed and polished version of the original garden hose shoe, exposure to the decision makers at large-scale retailers who are attending the event and paying attention to the award. These decision makers often want to be at the forefront of what's new in the industry, similar to the early adopter archetype that was mentioned earlier. And for the right product, like a high-tech, niche running enthusiast shoe, this was the perfect crowd. But they still had to win over this crowd and prove that their shoe was the one to pay attention to out of all of the products on display. On wasn't just walking into some small local trade show with a strange-looking shoe and hoping to get noticed. The ISPO Brand New Award had over 300 sports startups competing from around the world, and all of them are trying to be the next big thing in the sporting goods industry. They all had their own innovations, their own pitches, and their own reasons why their product was the one to pay attention to. Thankfully for On, they won this award with their prototype shoe. The shoe that started as garden hose pieces glued to the sole of a shoe took the award. This gave On the kind of external validation that is almost impossible to manufacture. So now not only did they have the social proof of the award to prove that it's a high quality product, but they had mass exposure to the exact type of people that they needed to be in front of. This single event was massive and essentially gave birth to the On brand in the public eye, because it provided the founders with instant credibility and led to over 500,000 Swiss francs in orders, which was around 470,000 US dollars at the time, before they'd even begun large-scale production of the shoes. Remember, they just had a prototype that they entered into this award show. They weren't even ready to fulfill these orders and weren't producing these shoes at a large scale yet. The story of On running starts at that award show and the shoe prototype, but as you may know, they went on to grow significantly and even partnered with the very, 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 very well-known tennis player, Roger Federer, which exploded the brand. And while it wasn't just a straight rise to the top, they did come close to bankruptcy early in the brand's history while trying to scale, but they ultimately went on to be massively successful and are now worth over 15 billion US dollars as of February 2026 estimates. But this early story of how they went from just a very rough idea into an actual concept, I always thought was very interesting. Because just thinking about it, it seems like a very difficult, almost impossible pipe dream of creating a shoe company that within the short span of 16 years goes on to rival the major companies in the shoe industry. The thing is though, they never actually expected this company to grow to this size. They just happened to create a shoe and a brand that resonated so much with people that it evolved from a niche specialty running shoe into an entire lifestyle brand that all sorts of people, importantly not just runners, buy. Because On didn't engineer that shift, it happened organically. Runners who wore the shoes for performance started wearing them all day, and people who'd never run a race in their life started buying them. The same thing has happened with a lot of other shoes over the decades, where if you build something functional enough and distinctive enough, and it becomes something that people wear for a specific purpose, like running, to something they can just wear any day for any reason. That transition and growth can't really be planned. You can't really fake your way into becoming a lifestyle brand. It either happens because the product is genuinely good enough that people want to wear it outside of its intended context, or it doesn't. And for On, it did. You start seeing it happen when runners wear the shoes to the grocery store, then to work, then people who have never run a race in their life start buying them because they look different to anything else on the market. That's the moment a performance brand becomes a lifestyle brand, and companies spend millions trying to manufacture that shift artificially. This brings it full circle to the garden hose. The thing that started as a prototype that the founders were embarrassed to wear in public became the most recognizable design element of one of the fastest growing shoe brands in the world. Sometimes the thing that you're tempted to hide ends up being the thing that sets you apart. There is a lot more to this story though, from the Roger Federer partnership to their explosion in growth over the last decade. But this is the story of their very first step, their very first concept, and how a guy who was gluing garden hoses to the sole of his shoe managed to get this idea off the ground with the help of his co-founders. I've always found the stories of how a project, whether it's like a company or a trend or even an artist, got its initial start and went from 0% to 1%. And I feel it's often forgotten. Like you might know about the Roger Federer partnership and their massive growth and size today, but what even put On in the position for Roger Federer to even notice this company? That's what I find the most interesting. On a similar note, thank you to the one person that subscribed to this channel. Thank you for being the early adopter of this channel.